The music of David Bowie is some of the most revered and celebrated in the history of rock music, pop music, and just recorded music in general. His work throughout the 1970s and even some of the early 1980s, not to mention a certain song from 1969, has been so ingrained into the collective musical consciousness that even if you don't really know a whole lot about David Bowie, you've definitely run into his music multiple times on the radio or as it's used in films. Maybe you've even seen him in a film, him and his family jewels. But for as highly respected and fondly remembered as songs like Space Oddity, The Man Who Sold the World, Rebel Rebel, Fame, and Let's Dance, or albums like The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, Aladdin Sane, Station to Station, the so-called Berlin Trilogy, and Scary Monsters and Super Creeps have become, and for good reason, there's a pretty sizable amount of music in Bowie's discography that a lot of people seem to have forgotten about. Maybe they're not even aware that he continued to make music after 1983's Let's Dance well into the early 2000s before taking a decade off and surprising everybody by making a return to recording in 2013 with The Next Day. Many will no doubt remember his final album, 2016's Black Star, but there's still 9 solo Bowie albums between Black Star and Let's Dance, which seem to only ever be discussed by the real proper music geeks like me. I recently listened to all 25 of David Bowie's solo albums in chronological order, and I just couldn't keep my thoughts about them all to myself, so I'm subjecting all of you to them. I want to take a look at some select moments from a few of these 9 albums between Bowie's alleged sellout record in 1983 and his swan song from 2016, because while his enduring legacy has always been marked by reinvention and a willingness to wear his influences on his sleeves in a unique way, the music he made in these 30 or so often overlooked years exemplifies those artistic traits maybe even better than some of his most popular work. Here are 5 underrated David Bowie songs. After Bowie released Let's Dance, which was his move to a more accessible pop sound, which wound up being the best-selling album of his whole career, he decided to continue in that musical direction for the follow-up album, 1984's Tonight. It proved to be yet another successful release commercially, but critics and many longtime fans weren't too keen on it, and when you listen to it, it's really not hard to see why. Apparently, Bowie was pretty minimally involved with the album's production, and it really shows. 5 of Tonight's 9 tracks are covers, and 3 of those covers are of songs by his longtime friend and collaborator Iggy Pop. Now, when David Bowie covers a song, it either turns out really good, or, as in the case of most of the covers here, it goes wrong pretty quickly. There's a version of God Only Knows, which is my favorite Beach Boys song of all time, and he just butchers it completely. But considering how he was mostly checked out for the creation of Tonight, I guess it makes sense that it turned out like this. And anyway, there is one really good song here, the 7-minute opener, Loving the Alien. This is a song about organized religion and about history. It was specifically inspired by Bowie's belief that so much history is wrong, as is being rediscovered all the time, and that we base so much on the wrong knowledge that we've gleaned. He seems particularly interested here in the conflict between Israel and Palestine, comparing their modern struggle to that of the Templars and Saccharins during the Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries. Bowie doesn't seem to believe much in the power of prayer either, claiming that it leads people to believe the strangest things. It's an interesting point of view on a very complicated subject, whatever your interpretation of his exact beliefs might be. Musically, Loving the Alien is a classic example of 80s cheese, but not to an extent that I would usually find off-putting or distracting. You've got that fat snare drum, washy synth leads, a small chorus of backup singers, a bluesy guitar solo towards the end. I mean, it's the whole 9 yards. But the other tracks on Tonight turn up the cheese dial far more with these horn sections and gentrified reggae grooves, and yeah, I can't say I'm a fan, but this opening track is a little more restrained, which just leads me to wonder what happened on the next 8 songs. Loving the Alien also includes one of my favorite features of 80s pop, a cool modulation between the verses and the choruses. I suggest listening to the original song first so you can better understand what I'm about to get into. I've had to recreate small portions of this song to avoid getting a copyright strike, and these little pieces only really tell part of the full story. So, Loving the Alien goes back and forth between a verse section in E minor and a verse that's basically in C major. I mean, there's a little bit of C minor stuff happening in that little 8-bar loop that the chorus is comprised of, but that's not really important for what we're going to talk about here. Like many of the best 80s pop and rock songs, this song makes a pretty simple key change sound really complicated. E minor and C major are already pretty close to each other in the circle of fifths. They share all but one note in common, so you really shouldn't need to do all that much to get from one to the other, but where's the fun in that? If we take a look at this moment between the end of the verse chord progression and the beginning of the pre-chorus, we have a B7, which is the 5-7 chord in E minor. In pop music and other styles of music that use functional harmony, 5-7 chords have dominant function, which means that their tendency is to resolve to the tonic chord or the 1 chord. I'll show you what I mean. This verse progression is an 8-bar loop that happens twice per verse, so when this dominant B7 or 5-7 chord happens 8 bars earlier, it makes for a really nice cadence back to the tonic E minor or 1 chord that this loop starts on. You've heard the sound of 5 going to 1 your whole life, even if you don't really know what it's called. It's just this innate quality in so much music that's derived from European harmonic ideas, where the bass leaps up a 4th or down a 5th, and everything just feels settled. This 5-1 cadence pattern illustrates the goal of tonal music, which is to get to dominant so that we can resolve back to tonic and start the cycle anew. But when we get to dominant, we can actually do any number of different things. This dominant 7th chord is quite malleable, and we can do a whole lot of wizardry and trickery with it if we're careful about it, which is exactly what Bowie does at this moment before the pre-chorus. You see, another possible resolution of the 5 chord is to step up to the 6 chord, which is called a deceptive cadence. The 1 chord and 6 chord share 2 out of 3 notes in common, which is why this works so well. If I play that chord progression in E minor from before, but resolve the B7 deceptively, you'll see why this cadence has its name. It almost feels like you've been deceived. Very cool. And as you can see, the 6th chord in E minor is C major, which is the key that we're trying to get to for the chorus. But although we could just resolve B7 to C and already be in the place we need to be, Bowie throws a left hook at us and resolves B7 to C minor, the first chord of the pre-chorus. This pre-chorus uses a bit of what's called modal interchange, which basically means that some of the chords here are from the key of C minor and others are from the parallel major key of C major. We're in this kind of in-between zone between C minor and C major, and we're not really sure which is which until we land on this G7 chord, which points us pretty unambiguously in the direction of C major as the bass line ascends up a C major scale from G until it hits the C all the way up here. But can you hear how it doesn't exactly land on what sounds like a firm downbeat? It's almost as if there's like an extra note or something. And what's all this in the transcription about? 4/6? Well, like the overwhelming majority of pop and rock songs, Loving the Alien is in 4/4, which means that every bar has 4 quarter notes in it. But for this cadence between G7 and C, the arrangement builds even more tension by having the whole band hit this unison pattern of quarter note triplets ascending the scale. Essentially, they're playing 3 notes in the space that 2 quarter notes would take. Again, this is a sound you've probably heard quite a lot. But if we ascended the scale, keeping everything in perfect 4/4 time, we'd arrive on C somewhere between beats 3 and 4 of a bar. And if we took out a note and dropped a couple beats to make that C fit on the downbeat, we wouldn't have that perfect ascending feeling because the unity of that ascending major scale sound would be lost. So instead, Bowie opts to just reset where the downbeat is. He takes that first example and just makes that space between beats 3 and 4 the new 1. It looks sort of strange here because I had to transcribe it using an irrational time signature. If you're watching me, you probably know who Adam Neely is, but in case you're unfamiliar with irrational time signatures, not mathematically irrational, but musically irrational, basically quarter note triplets can be thought of as 6th notes because they break up a whole note into 6 evenly spaced pulses the same way a quarter note breaks it up into 4, and the same way 8th notes break it up into 8. So this bar of 4/6 is a bar of 4 quarter note triplets, or 4 sixth notes, like how 4/4 is 4 quarter notes. The partial triplet bracket here is there for the sake of clarity when reading the notation. I highly doubt anybody involved in the process of making Loving the Alien was thinking in terms of irrational time signatures, but this is the cleanest way to represent what's happening in musical notation, and as an added bonus, it gives me a reason to talk about irrational time signatures in a video about pop rock. But even divorced from how extremely nerdy this is, I think this pre-chorus builds and resolves tension both harmonically and rhythmically in a really interesting way. Hence why I even bothered talking about this song from an album I don't like. So after the simultaneous commercial success and critical failure of Tonight and its even worse follow-up album 1987's Never Let Me Down, God, I don't want to think about this one for more than a few seconds. Bowie took some time off from doing solo albums to try and recenter himself creatively. He had this band called Tin Machine for a few years, which was a thing, and he got married in 1992. That same year, he linked back up with producer Nile Rodgers, who had also produced Let's Dance about a decade prior, to fully reinvent himself and kick off a sort of late career revival with the album Black Tie White Noise, released in 1993. I know this album's had a bit of a mixed response ever since it came out, but if I'm being totally honest, I think it gets far too much flack. Compared to the albums that came before this, where Bowie sounds like he's asleep at the wheel, this is a breath of fresh air. He was inspired to make this album because of his recent marriage, with a couple of the songs on here actually having been derived from stuff that he wrote for his own wedding ceremony. The music is a really strange synthesis of ideas from house music, acid jazz, and even some early hip-hop brought into the fold of Bowie's pop songwriting style. On a personal note, he plays a lot of saxophone on this album, more than on any other album of his, and his playing style is interesting, but you know, it gets the job done. It was his first instrument. If he wants to play it, I'm fine with it. He's done that before anyway. I should also mention that this was the final Bowie album to feature guitarist Mick Ronson, who played on Bowie albums through the early 70s. He appears on a cover of the Cream song I Feel Free, and he unfortunately died of cancer less than a month after this album's release. The song that I think best exemplifies the sound and style of Black Tie White Noise, and just my favorite song on the album generally, is the lead single Jump They Say. Content warning, I'm gonna talk a bit about this song's lyrics, which touch on themes of mental illness and suicide. If that's not your bag, you can skip to the time code on screen to hear more about the music itself. Jump They Say was a song written in honor of Bowie's half-brother Terry Burns, who had died by suicide in 1985. Bowie had written songs inspired by Terry as early as 1970, with the song All the Madmen from The Man Who Sold the World being inspired by his schizophrenia and his status as a patient in a psychiatric hospital. Bowie was unable to cope with Terry's death at the time, so hearing him discuss it 8 years after the fact, even in the sort of indirect way that this song deals with it, you really get the sense that he feels a lot of regret over the whole situation. While I don't think the song is 100% accurate to Terry's experiences, the end product certainly has a lot to say about mental illness, how often people don't take these conditions as seriously as they ought to, which puts the people affected by conditions like schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder, or what have you, into situations where all they feel they can do is jump. They say he has no brain. They say he has no mood. They say he was born again. They say look at him climb. They say jump. They say jump. On the musical end of Jump They Say, Nile Rodgers provides a drum loop and a guitar track that's straight out of some kind of acid funk jam, and provides such an infectious backbone for the whole song to build upon. The chorus changes the mood in a very subtle way by moving into a minor key, and it has a really interesting sax part from Bowie where his instrument seems to sort of warble through its melodic line in a way that gives the song this interesting organic component that juxtaposes really nicely against the sort of unchanging drum loop and generally section-based nature of the production generally speaking. There's also a really cool breakdown in the middle where trumpeter Lester Bowie, no relation, goes nuts over the drum break, and it's just a lot of fun. He makes appearances more than a few times on Black Tie White Noise, and he's one of my favorite parts of the album. And that outro with the backing vocals repeatedly singing the line "Gotta Believe Somebody" ends the song on a truly poignant note. If you listen to one song from this album, make it Jump They Say, although I would highly suggest you check out the whole record too. It's in desperate need of critical reappraisal. Not necessarily a masterpiece, but far better than a lot of people are willing to give it credit for. Bowie continued his 90s creative streak with the 1995 album Outside, another album that saw him linking up with prior collaborators. This time, instead of Nile Rodgers, we have Brian Eno, who played a big part in the direction Bowie took during his Berlin albums, especially Low and Heroes, which devote a lot of time to the ambient music which Eno gave its name and pioneered with his own ambient series of albums. But of course, Eno is far from just being the ambient music guy, and I think that's pretty well demonstrated by Outside, which sees Bowie going in a direction heavily inspired by industrial rock. The supporting tour for this album featured Nine Inch Nails as a supporting act, and I don't think that's on accident. Eno's creative outlook also made for a much different kind of album. Bowie wrote the music with his band in collaborative improv sessions, and Eno's oblique strategies flashcards were used during writing and recording, which led the musicians in Bowie's band into some creative directions I don't think they'd have gone in otherwise. David Bruce has a video about these cards that you should definitely check out if you want to know what I mean. There's also a post-apocalyptic sci-fi narrative running through Outside, and the reason the number 1 appears in the title is because this was supposed to be the first of a 3-chapter album cycle where the characters and story here were further developed. But seeing as that never happened, I don't really think it's something you necessarily need to pay a whole lot of attention to, but we're going to talk about it anyway because I think it's a piece of the puzzle of this album that actually provides a lot of insight. But with or without that narrative piece, this is the one 80s/90s Bowie album I think most fans will be familiar with apart from Let's Dance, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better one to single out. There are a lot of songs on Outside that I could single out for inclusion on this list, like The Heart's Filthy Lesson, a strange electronic alt-rock dirge, Hallo Space Boy, a song that actually kind of managed to jump scare me in a way that didn't feel cheap, or any of the final 3 songs which end this album on a really thrilling note and are definitely some of my favorites. But instead, let's talk about Wishful Beginnings. So the songs on this album are all sung from the perspective of different characters in the story, and this one is sung by a character referred to as the artist Minotaur. So here's the basic gist of the narrative of Outside. It's set in a dystopian version of the then not so far off year of 1999, in which murder and mutilation have come to be seen as a form of art. The central character is Detective Nathan Adler, who works for a newly established government bureau which investigates this art crime, as he follows a trail of events which had led to the murder of a young teenager called Baby Grace Blue at the hands of this artist Minotaur person to determine if her murder qualifies as art or if it's just debased filth. Very morbid having the murderer be referred to as an artist. Bowie was really into this taboo concept of murder and human sacrifice as a sort of art project, as written about by people like Thomas de Quincey, as the 20th century was coming to a close. All this very creepy dystopian stuff is hard to think about without drawing comparison to earlier albums like Diamond Dogs, although I think Outside is far more fully realized both narratively and I might even dare to say musically, and Wishful Beginnings is one of those moments that I think really adds a lot to the album overall. This is one of the most sparse and harrowing pieces of music in the Bowie discography, with an extremely simple backdrop of electronic percussion, the occasional spooky synth chord, and this huge bass hit that happens every 2 bars or so, which is accompanied by what almost sounds like digitized laughter. Bowie's voice hovers over this macabre instrumental in a way that doesn't really point to any particular tonal center. It's hard for me to not think of all of this as some sort of twisted response to Schoenberg's Pierrot Lunaire. I apologize for my French. And lyrically, I find it hard not to squirm in my seat a little bit as the artist Minotaur describes his act of murder as a sort of ritual. Please hide from the kiss and the bite. Shame burns. Breathing in, breathing out. Breathing in only doubt. The pain must feel like snow. I'm no longer your golden boy. Sorry, little girl. I'm sorry, little girl. This isn't really a case where I'd say this is the one song from an album you should check out above any of the others. Outside is excellent from start to finish, and probably one of my top 10 Bowie albums. Wishful Beginnings is just a moment that really stands out to me that I don't usually see getting brought up a whole lot, even in conversations about this album. In fact, it was actually cut from some reissues and pressings of Outside, so even Bowie fans who think they own all of his work and have heard everything might not even know it exists if they have one of the wrong pressings. It's a real shame since I think it embodies an interesting dimension of horror that he never really tapped into all that much. After the release of Outside came the albums Earthling in 1997 and Hours in 1999. Honestly, these are more for Bowie completionists. Earthling is probably the strangest album he ever made, which makes it a mild curiosity. It's a strange amalgamation of the industrial rock explored on Outside, but with a very heavy drum and bass influence. I do quite like it, actually, probably because of just how absurd it is. I mean, if you've ever wanted to hear David Bowie sing over the Amen break, here you go. Meanwhile, Hours is probably my least favorite Bowie album, honestly. It's just so devoid of any of the creativity that had made any of his last 3 albums so interesting. It's like the lifeless, empty husk of a 90s alt-rock album. Thankfully, Bowie's next album would be a massive improvement over Hours. He linked back up with Tony Visconti, who had acted variously as a co-producer and bassist on many of his most famous albums and songs, for the first time since Scary Monsters, and the result was 2002's Heathen, Heathen. I would posit that this is David Bowie's most underrated album, at least if we're going by Metacritic and Rate Your Music aggregate scores. The material here isn't necessarily consistently amazing, but it is very consistently good, which I think even some of Bowie's most popular records don't even necessarily manage. I mean, that cover of Let's Spend the Night Together on Aladdin Sane, I could live without it. The making of Heathen was notoriously marked by both the death of Bowie's mother in April 2001, and then, of course, the September 11th attacks a few months later. These events seem to have cast a dark shadow over Bowie and his collaborators as they wrapped production, especially on this album's final song, one of my favorite all-time Bowie ballads, Heathen, The Rays. This is one of the early moments in the later period of Bowie's career, if that makes sense, where he starts to wrestle with the idea of his own mortality. In an interview with the Daily Beast, he singled this song out as maybe his favorite that he had written up until that point. Maybe he was just sort of riding on the hype of the new album cycle or something, but his comments on it I think are really illuminating. It seems to be a summation of some kind, and I think will become a personal milestone of some sort to me. It contains for me a strong indication of how beautiful and wonderful life is, and how I regret that I will have to relinquish my hold upon it. I only could have written it at my present age. This song has an extremely cinematic flair with layers of muted horns and washed out guitars and synth pads, setting the stage for one of Bowie's most despondent and terse sets of lyrics. He was 55 when Heathen came out, not terribly old, but I have no doubt he was feeling very reflective as the new millennium began and as his mother had recently passed. You say you'll leave me, and when the sun is low and the rays high, I can see it now, I can feel it die. The way Bowie sings ballads has always captivated me. There's not a lot of rhythm here for him to tether his voice to, apart from a quiet eighth note pulse in the drums that sometimes has a backbeat and sometimes doesn't, and I really like how this gives him the space to just float over his own music. It provides an ending to this album that's as ethereal and serene as it is somber and bone-chilling. Bowie would release another album just over a year after Heathen, again with Visconti playing a big role in the production. This album, Reality, easily takes the cake for his worst ever album art, but honestly, the album itself isn't all that bad. It's certainly a lot more upbeat than Heathen, but it doesn't really do much for me. After this, Bowie would retire from performing live and seemingly from recording new music. As 1 year turned into 2, 4, and nearly 10, people were just left to assume that Reality would be the last David Bowie album, but as we all know, he surprised everybody with the release of The Next Day in 2013, going so far as to have everyone involved in the album's production sign non-disclosure agreements and recording in total secrecy. This is where our journey ends as far as this video is concerned. After this, there was only one album left to go, Black Star in 2016, and I mean, there's not a single underrated song on there as far as I'm aware. They're all fantastic, and I'm pretty sure everybody recognizes that they're all fantastic, so I don't really need to go into much detail about that. But when it comes to The Next Day, I think there's definitely some stuff here that goes kinda overlooked. It seems like when Black Star came out, people sort of left this album behind, which I just don't think is all that fair. To me, The Next Day demonstrates that even when Bowie wasn't making music, he still had his finger on the pulse of the musical climate around him, particularly the ways rock music had changed and evolved in his time off. There's a lot of material here that actually sounds very influenced by indie rock and the post-punk revival and other 2000s rock kind of things, whether it be The Stars Are Out Tonight, which I think kind of has echoes of The Killer's Mr. Brightside. Valentine's Day has a sort of Interpol flair, and the song I'm choosing to highlight most of all, Love Is Lost, fits in so well with the musical climate of the time that it made for a really, really good LCD Sound System song. I mean, it's not really an LCD Sound System song, it's the Hello Steve Reich mix by James Murphy of Love Is Lost, which, you know, just basically sounds like David Bowie fronting an LCD Sound System song. It's really good. But in terms of the original version of Love Is Lost, it harkens back to an album like Low in a big way, and yet it doesn't just sound like a retread of old ideas. In a way, I think it's an accurate musical reflection of the lyrical content, which paints a picture of a starry-eyed young person coming into stardom with all the hope and enthusiasm in the world, but as their career progresses, they become more and more disillusioned, carrying with them all this deep pain and trauma. It It may be a meta-commentary on Bowie's own career trajectory from the early to mid-70s, with his rise to international fame after Ziggy Stardust and his eventual mental collapse upon moving to America and developing a serious drug addiction by the time he was making Young Americans, and especially Station to Station. There's this great moment coming out of the third stanza of lyrics, which is presented with different musical materials from the other three. This stanza moves the music from B-flat minor to a chord progression starting on E major, a chord with a root note a tritone away from B-flat, which is the farthest possible distance between two notes in our 12-tone system. When the song shifts back to the original key, it doesn't do so all at once. For a brief moment, you hear B-flat and E rub up against each other. It's one of the most effective uses of the particular dissonant quality that tritone relations have that I've come across in this style of music, and it sets up the final bleak stanza perfectly. Say hello to the lunatic men. Tell them your secrets, they're like the grave. Oh, what have you done? Oh, what have you done? Love is lost. Lost is love. You know so much, it's making you cry. You refuse to talk, but you think like mad. You've cut out your soul and the face of thought. Oh, what have you done? Oh, what have you done? So that's just 5 of the many great David Bowie songs there are out there waiting to be heard from this strange in-between period of his. I would highly recommend you check out some of the albums these songs come from if you haven't already, particularly Black Tie, White Noise, Outside, Heathen, and The Next Day. If there's any songs you feel strongly about from this middle period of Bowie's output, I'd love to discuss them in the comments. I didn't even mention some of his work for film and television, like his song with the Pat Metheny Group for The Falcon and the Snowman, or the Buddha of Suburbia record, which some people consider as one of his bona fide solo albums. There's just so much to talk about with David Bowie. I mean, what an incredible legacy of amazing music he left behind. I hope to do more videos like this that aren't just giant album review marathons in the future. That was always my intention with this channel going in, and it feels good to actually be following through. So anyway, till next time.